Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the quarterfinal match in the Speed Chess Championship between Magnus Carlsen, the 5-time world champion, and Arjun Ergaisi from India, currently ranked number 4 in the world. Now, as we know, Hans Niemann won in one of the quarterfinal matches yesterday against Wesley. So if Magnus wins this match, we will have an epic matchup in the semifinals of the Speed Chess Championship between Magnus and Hans, a match that many people have been wanting to see for a long time now. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. The first game we're going to be taking a look at, Magnus is playing with the white pieces, Arjun with the black pieces, and this is the very first game of the match. So the game starts with the move e4, we get e5, knight to f3, knight to f6, Arjun playing the classic Petrov defense. Now recently, Jan Nepomniachtchi has actually made this opening his mainstay. I shouldn't say super recently because he's been doing it for a few years now, but ever since Jan started taking this up permanently, many world championship matches and elite players have taken up the Petrov. You have Jan, you have Fabiano before that, so it's not a super big surprise. So we get knight takes pawn, d6 is played, we get knight to f3, knight takes e4, and now Magnus plays this move queen to e2. Now it's the very first game of the match, and I could tell from the reaction from Magnus, he was definitely surprised by the Petrov, so he decided to create something and play on the fly. We get queen to e7, we have the move g3 being played, now we get the move knight c6, bishop to g2, and now we have the move bishop g4. Here, Magnus plays this very provocative move d3, which is very much to the point. Now, when you play these systems with queen e2 and queen e7, very frequently you get some normal position like this. For example, queens come off the board. It's a very dry endgame, but for a player of Magnus's caliber, this is a position that he excels in. So with Arjun playing bishop g4 and Magnus playing d3, this allows Arjun to go for this knight jump to d4 immediately, attacking the queen and the knight. White takes knight, you lose the queen and the game. So queen takes knight, takes on f3 here. Worth pointing out that if black were to trade the queens and go knight c2, forking the king and the rook here, white can go king to d1, knight takes rook, knight c3, let's just say bishop e7, and after b3 followed by bishop to b2, this knight on a1 is going to be lost. So Arjun goes knight f3, we get king to f1, now we have the queen trade, and we get the move knight to d4. If Arjun were to castle here, for example, this might be a mistake because after h3, bishop h5, and g4, suddenly the bishop and the knight are both under attack. So we get the move knight to d4, Magnus goes knight to a3, guarding the pawn, we get g6, c3 being played, knight c6, f4, bishop g7, and now we have the move king f2. Here Arjun plays bishop back to d7. Main reason for Arjun playing this move is if you were to castle after f5, you do run some risk here, because if you play a move like, let's just say a6 after h3, bishop h5, and g4, your bishop on h5 is simply going to be trapped. Additionally, if you take on f5 after h3, bishop h5, and takes, again, this g4 threat is very serious, and in order to avoid losing the bishop, you have to play f6, which now walls in the bishop. So we get bishop to d7 being played by Arjun. Now we have knight c2, castles, knight e3, knight to e7, bishop d2, and we get the move rook h e8. Here Magnus plays rook h to e1, and we get this move f5. Now at this point, the opening phase is over, the middle game phase is over. We're in the end game. It's a very balanced position here. Neither side really has an advantage. But keep in mind, this is Magnus Carlsen, who's made a living over his chess career of winning quote-unquote drawn endgames. So we get takes, bishop takes f5, and now Magnus goes h3, trying to use the pawn majority on the king side. He has 3 pawns here versus the 2 black pawns. We get to move h5, king to f3, d5, and now we have g4 being played. Arjun checks, we get king g3, and now we get the trade of the bishops, and the move d4 is played here by Magnus. Now Arjun trades the rooks, or Magnus trades the rooks, I should say, and we get the move king to f3. At this point, very balanced, but white might have a slight advantage here due to the potential to create a pass pawn on the king side, whereas black is very far behind. It's very hard to create a pass pawn here, even though you have a 4-on-3 on the queen side. So we get takes. Arjun plays rook to h8, a logical move to take the h file away from the white rook. Magnus goes king g3, and now we get this move king d7. We have rook to e1, and here Arjun plays this move c5. Now c5 is a completely reasonable move, but it's actually not the move that I would have played here. Personally, I like the move b5 here, stopping white from going c4, because if white ever trades on d4 and we get b3 and c5, now black is very close to creating a pass pawn on the queen side, and black should have no issues whatsoever. Instead, Arjun goes c5, and now Magnus plays this move c4. Now, the reason I really don't like the structure for Arjun is, keep in mind, in an endgame, These pawns on c5 and d4, they are on the same color as the dark square bishop on d2, whereas Magnus very likely is going to get something like, let's say, b6, b3. All these pawns are in the opposite color of this bishop, so all of black's pawns can be much more easily attacked. So after c4, we get a6, Magnus plays a4, and here Arjun spends a long time before making the first big mistake of the game with king d6. Now we're on move number 33, very deep in the game. Players are getting a little bit low on time. I don't know why the clocks aren't showing, actually. But this was a situation where I thought that Arjun should have tried to go for it with this move b5, temporarily sacrificing a pawn. If white takes and you go rook to b8 here, now you're trying to push the pawns up the board. Their weaknesses on the b file, and black should not be worse. Arjun was most likely concerned about the move rook to a1, swinging the rook over to go for the infiltration with rook a7. But after bishop to f8 takes and bishop d6 here, with rook b8 incoming once again and spying the pawns on the king side, black should not be worse. So instead, Arjun goes king d6, and now Magnus starts to take over the game. He plays this great move, pawn to a5, fixing the pawns on the queen side. You can never go b5 anymore, and now white can play f5 or even b4. White controls all the pawn breaks, and white is starting to take over. So Arjun goes g5 here, a desperation move, trying to create some counterplay here. He's trying to argue with this protected passed pawn. If white takes and you get something like this, maybe there's some hope with a rook h2, maybe there's some hope with like a rook f8, something along these lines, like rook f8, king g3, and rook g8, and this pawn hopefully will save the day. But after g5, Magnus now blitzes out the best move in the position, pawn to b4, and everything is starting to collapse here for black. Now that you have a problem with the pawn on g5, problem with the pawn on c5, the rook can infiltrate. There's also f5, and here Magnus is simply going to win the game. We get rook c8 from Arjun. Magnus trades on c5. He takes on g5. Now keep in mind, even though the clocks aren't being displayed correctly here, players are relatively low. I think Magnus had about 15 seconds and Arjun had about 5. So don't expect precision. So we get the move d3. Magnus plays rook e7, creating the classic kebab on the 7th. We get this move bishop to f8, rook d7, king takes, and now g6 from Magnus, trying to push this g-pawn up the board and get a queen. Arjun plays bishop c5, Magnus goes g7, and now we get this move b5, which loses. What Arjun should have played was the move rook g8, stopping the pawn, and after king f4, bishop d4, king e4, bishop g7, check here, and now king takes d3. White will end up a pawn in this position, but black has pretty decent chances to draw due to being able to pressure both of the white pawns very easily. Instead, Arjun plays b5 with I think like 2 seconds left. Magnus goes rook c7. I believe Arjun flags here and loses the game on time, but nonetheless the position is very bad. Now Arjun could have kept fighting on with this move rook to e8 here because it stops bishop to e3, for example, but nonetheless, after king h4 followed by king h5, king h6, and king h7, white should be winning. Additionally, you cannot go bishop d6 checking the king and attacking the rook at the same time, because then that would put your king in check. So Magnus wins this game on time. He is winning by the end of the game, but this game really sort of, for me, epitomizes how seriously Magnus is taking this match against Arjun, because one of the things that Magnus likes to do is when he needs to play against the top guys and he has a style that works, he is a master of endgames. He wins so many drawn endgames because his technique is just out of this world. It's second to none. Whereas versus some other players like the junior Pragnananta, for example, in Norway, he played a very sharp tactical game in a Sicilian. He got outplayed and lost. So it shows just how serious Magnus is, that he's going right back to his bread and butter, which is all about the end games. So Magnus wins the first game of the match, take a 1-0 lead. They would draw the second game. Arjun will win the third game. And so with the score, I believe 1.5, we'll jump into the next game. Sorry that I didn't have it right at the start, with Arjun having the white pieces. So we got the move d4 here from Arjun. I will flip this board for this game. We got the move knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to f3, and now Magnus plays d5. Here we get knight to c3, and now Magnus plays the move a6 here. Now there are many different setups that black can go for in these positions. Black can play h6, a6, c6, or traditional queen's gambit decline with bishop e7. So we get a6, Arjun trades on d5, bishop f4, bishop to d6, and now we get the trade of the bishops on d6. Now here a6 is very justified because it stops white from jumping to b5 with the knight. We get e3, castles, bishop to d3 being played, and now Magnus goes b6. Here we get castles, bishop b7, queen c2, and now we have knight d7 with the idea of c5. Arjun goes rook fd1, we get rook fe8, and now we have the move a3, and Magnus goes c5 before white can play the move b4, trying to stop black from pushing the pawn. So we get c5, pawn takes, and now we have the move b4 from Arjun, trying to sacrifice a pawn on the queen side temporarily. Magnus plays rook a c8. We got pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now the move rook a c1. And here Magnus demonstrates a really good understanding when he plays this move d4. Now black's big issue in this position is you have this potentially isolated pawn on d5 here, which can become a very big weakness. But when Magnus goes d4, when Arjun takes, and by the way, the computer does like bishop f5, gives white a very small advantage, but it's a hard move to play with only 3 minutes on the clock. After knight takes pawn, white is temporarily up a pawn, but after knight to g4, suddenly there's some massive threats towards the king side here. Weaknesses on h2 and g2. Arjun goes g3. We got the swap. And now after queen takes a3, we've had a massive transformation where material remains balanced still. Both sides have the same number of pawns, but Magnus suddenly has this awesome light square b on the long diagonal, and Arjun has no light square b. There's no fianchetto. So with the empty diagonal here, black is simply much better. Game continues with h3. We get knight to e5, queen to c2 being played, and now Magnus plays h5, a move which is designed to create the lift for the king on h7, but black can also potentially play pawn to h4. Here Arjun goes king to f1. We get a5. Now we have queen b3, bishop to a6, king g2. We have the swap, and after knight to d3, white's rook and knight are very loose in this position. So Arjun goes rook c2, Magnus plays a repetition, and now he goes rook to c7 here, intending to double stack the rooks on the c file, go after the knight on c3, and white is simply going to lose material here. If you play a move like knight to a1 to guard the rook, after rook c8, knight and the rook are both very loose here. Bishop guards the knight. White is going to lose material and the game. So Arjun goes knight to d4. We get rook to c8. Now we have knight to e2. Arjun desperately trying to hang on. We get to move knight to b4, rook d2, and now Magnus takes the knight on c3. Now Arjun could have played rook c1 here, and if he had done this, it would have been interesting to see how the game continues. Probably Arjun figured that after something like a4 or bishop b7, with all these weaknesses and pressure on the c file, Arjun decided that he'd rather try to go for something a little bit simpler. So he plays rook d2, Magnus sacks the rook for the 2 horses, and now we get check, king h7, rook d7, and we get the move bishop c4 here, trying to guard the pawn, but then escort this a pawn up the board. Arjun plays rook to a7. We get a4 here. Very nasty trick from Magnus, because now if white takes the pawn, we have bishop to b3, and both of these rooks are under attack. Arjun plays rook to a3. We got bishop to d5, checking the king on g2 and creating the fossil. Rook takes bishop, and now Magnus correctly plays knight takes rook on d5. He does not play rook takes rook, because after takes, king g8 and rook b5, white now has 2 pawns in return for the knight and has very good drawing chances. So we get knight takes rook, knight guards the rook, and the rest is pretty basic, so I won't really say a whole lot about it. But the game will eventually conclude where Magnus slowly pushes forward. He ends up getting this knight on e4. He's able to get the pawn on g4, and Arjun resigns. If you take, there's knight c3, winning the rook. And after king g2 and a move like f5 followed by knight to g5 here, let's just say rook b2, knight g5, you have ideas with rook c1, you have ideas with knight to f3 here, and black will be winning, especially because white cannot push the pawns and trade off any material here. So Arjun decides quite simply after h takes g4 to resign this game and give up and focus on the next game. So we've looked at 2 of Magnus's wins. Now the next thing we're going to look at is a game which Magnus has the white pieces against Arjun. This is in the 3+1 portion. Now through the 5+1 portion, Magnus won it by a score of 4.5 to 2.5, but Arjun was always relatively close throughout this match. So we get d4, d5, bishop to f4 here from Magnus. Magnus deciding to play the London system here against Arjun, and now we get the move knight f6. Now keep in mind, Arjun is one of the Indian trio of Pragg, Gukesh. Actually, trio is the wrong word, but one of the duo between Arjun and Pragg, who both have played the London system a lot with the white pieces. So we get e3, e6, knight to f3, we got c5, knight bd2, and now Arjun plays the move knight c6. Here Magnus plays this move h4, and I think the idea behind h4 from Magnus was he wanted to start trying to attack on the king side. This is also in the spirit of playing Alpha Zero-esque with pushing the pawn forward. On the other hand, since I did not see this game live, it's possible Magnus meant to play h3, creating the square for the bishop, and he simply made a mouse slip with h4, but actually I don't know because I wasn't watching it live. But after h4, we get queen to b6 from Arjun, putting pressure on the pawns on d4 and b2. We have the move takes on c5, takes on b2, and now we get the move rook b1. Arjun plays queen to a3 here. We get bishop b5, bishop takes pawn, and now Magnus plays h5, trying to push the pawn forward. Here Arjun goes to h6, and now we get to move knight to e5, bishop d7, takes, and we have this move c4 being played. Now what's phenomenally remarkable about this position, or in general Magnus's play, is that even when we take stock of the position, which is white has 1 2 3 4 5 6 and Arjun is 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, even though Magnus has already blundered a pawn away, he's pushed the pawn on the h file, he still understands the theme so well, and he's going for c4, trying to play with the two bishops, open up the center of the board, in spite of how badly the opening has gone. And this is probably the single biggest strength Magnus has, which is that even when he gets a bad position or he knows he's done something wrong, he still can focus on the themes and still find very good moves in spite of it, whereas many players do emotionally collapse after they've made a big mistake in the opening. So we get knight to f6 from Arjun, we have bishop to e5, bishop e7, takes, and now we get to move queen to a4. As you'll notice, now Magnus is better. Magnus is going to win the game, right? Even though he was worse in the opening, it just shows how good this player is. So we get queen takes, Arjun castles here to guard the pawn on b7, we get takes, and now we have the move king e2. Arjun plays bishop d6, trying to trade off the b's, we got bishop takes, pawn takes, and now the move knight to f3. Black is still up a pawn here, but with the doubled pawns on f7 and f6 combined with this weak pawn on c6 and a knight jump to f5, it feels like Magnus should still win the game. We get king to c7. Magnus plays knight d4, we get rook to b8, and now we have the move rook hc1, which is a fairly serious inaccuracy because now Arjun is able to trade the rooks and play this move rook to g8, attacking the pawn on g2, but much more importantly, if white plays g3, there's rook to g5 here, which forces this white rook back to h1 to guard the pawn, and now there's no longer knight f5 either. So we get takes, rook g8, Magnus goes king to f3 here, we get the move rook to c8 being played. In this case, Arjun decides that if he goes rook g5, white will play g4 here, supporting the pawn on h5, and then knight f5 is coming on the next move, whereas as I mentioned, after g3 rook g5 here, you no longer can guard the pawn and force knight f5 at the same time. So Arjun goes rook to c8, we get king g4, now we have a6 being played so that black can push the c pawn without allowing knight to b5. We get king to f5, c5, and now we have knight e2, and Arjun plays the move rook g8 back to the square. Magnus goes g3, we get to move bishop to e7, guarding the pawn and threatening to go rook g5, winning the pawn on h5. Magnus plays f4 to stop rook g5, and now we get to move king c6. Rook c1 is played, and we get to move rook to b8. Arjun showing very, very good understanding here, by the way, because now that there are far fewer squares, the knight can no longer get to the f5 square. If white goes g4 here, g5 is never really a threat in this position because you can always just take, and the bishop and the pawn guard each other. So great understanding from Arjun. This shows his skill as a player, swinging the rook to g8 to c8 to b8 now, taking the open file, and Arjun is very close to winning the game. Magnus plays e4 here, Arjun plays rook to b2, we got pawn takes pawn, king takes, knight c3, and now we have the move king to d4. Arjun using the king as an active piece to try and push the c pawn forward, use this rook on the b file, and Magnus will have to be very, very careful if he wants to avoid losing the game. So we get the move knight to e4, Arjun goes c4, we get rook d1, king to e3, and now we have the move rook to e1, and Arjun plays king f3. Keep in mind, these moves might look like blunders to you guys, but the player's so low on time, it's a very, very difficult position to play. And also keep in mind here, the black is always threatening, let's just say you go a3, to go for the checkmate with rook b5, as the king has no squares available. So Magnus plays knight d2 here, Arjun takes a knight, Magnus captures the bishop, we get rook to d5, an all-star move, by the way, because after king takes f6, there's now rook to c5. The rook is behind the passed pawn, and at this point, Magnus Carlsen is going to lose the endgame. We get rook to e1, takes, f5, c3, king f7, c2, rook to c1 is played, and now we have the move rook f5. Now keep in mind there was apparently a mistake here. I guess black was supposed to take the pawn first, because after c2, maybe Magnus could have played the move f6 here. No, I guess f6 is a blunder. So apparently you're supposed to go king g6, and after queen takes, you take, and this is supposed to be a draw, don't ask me why, but apparently it is. Whereas after rook to c1, now Arjun can capture here, we get king g6, rook c5, takes, and now we have the move king to g4, where white will lose this pawn on h5, and the game will end shortly. Magnus goes king g6, we get check, king f7, and now king takes pawn, and black simply is going to make a beeline to the d2 square with the king, win the rook, and get a queen and the game. We get king e7, king g4, king d7, rook c3, king d6, king f3, And after king to d5 and king to e3, Magnus Carlsen resigns this game, and Arjun gets a very big win in very, very nice and very technical fashion in this game to bring the match back to 2 points. Now, I wish that I could do super long videos for like hours and hours, but at the end of the day, most of you guys like the shorter videos, so we're going to stop with the games there. This would bring it back to 2-point lead, and the match actually remained very, very close throughout. Magnus, I think, at the absolute maximum, had a 5-point lead very briefly, but ultimately it would end with Magnus winning this match by a score of 12-9. I would say Magnus did not play his best chess. It was very, very evidently clear from some of these games. Arjun, I think, played phenomenally well throughout the match. I really can't fault him. I think he played a great match. If Magnus were on, maybe the margin would have been bigger, but nonetheless, it was still good enough for Magnus to win this match and set up the legendary semifinal match in Paris in the finals of the Speed Chess Championship between Magnus and Hans. So everybody's really looking forward to that. We'll see what happens. Tomorrow, I am going to be playing in the last quarterfinal match. I play against Jan Nepomniachtchi. If I win my match tomorrow against Jan, I will join Ali Reza, Hans, and Magnus in Paris. If I lose, Jan goes. So if I win, I play Ali Reza. If I don't, then it's Nepo Ali Reza. But of course, the semifinal that everyone's been dying for between Magnus and Hans will finally happen in about 3 weeks. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the quarterfinals of the Speed Chess Championship and the match between Magnus Carlsen and the rising Indian super talent Arjun Ergaisi. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and I'll be back with some more great recaps in the very near future. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your day. See you guys. Bye.